we're going to tell you the story of an innovation that changed the course of the Pacific War. It's a story about a middle-aged maverick who took bombers and transformed them into something the textbooks said couldn't work. It's about engineers who insisted the modifications would tear the aircraft apart, about pilots who flew missions that defied conventional wisdom, and about a 3-day battle that proved everyone wrong. This is the story of Pappy, Gunn, the B-25 Mitchell bomber, and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. In March 1943, a Japanese convoy carrying nearly 7,000 troops steamed toward New Guinea, expecting to reinforce their garrison and continue their advance toward Australia. What they encountered instead was a revolutionary weapons system that would sink 12 vessels in just 3 days, costing Japan over 3,000 lives whilst the Allies lost just 13 airmen. This wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a fundamental shift in how air power could dominate naval forces, proving that land-based bombers could not only challenge, but completely devastate a naval convoy. But to understand how this happened, we need to go back to 1942, to the dark days when America was struggling in the Pacific, when conventional bombing tactics were failing spectacularly, and when one unorthodox aviator decided the rulebook needed to be rewritten. Throughout the first year of the war in the Pacific, American airmen struggled to hit moving ships from high altitude, with warships proving particularly elusive for medium-level bombing. The mathematics were brutal. A bomber flying at 20,000 feet would release its payload, and by the time those bombs fell through 4 miles of air, a destroyer could easily change course. Wind drift, atmospheric conditions, human error, all conspired to make high-altitude bombing of ships a waste of ordnance. The statistics told a grim story. Bombing runs that should have devastated enemy convoys instead resulted in endless splashes in empty water. Pilots would return from missions having expended their entire bomb load without scoring a single hit. The B-17 Flying Fortresses, magnificent aircraft though they were, simply couldn't reliably strike moving targets from altitude. The Japanese knew this. Their ship captains had learned that aggressive maneuvering could dodge bombs dropped from high above. Torpedo attacks offered an alternative, but they required extensive specialized training that most bomber crews lacked. The aircraft had to fly slow and straight for an extended period whilst releasing torpedoes, making them extraordinarily vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo bombers were being shot down at alarming rates, and there simply weren't enough trained crews to make up for the losses. The situation was desperate. Japan was reinforcing its positions throughout the Southwest Pacific, bringing in troops and supplies by sea. American and Australian forces were trying to halt this flow, but without an effective means of attacking shipping, the Japanese convoys kept getting through. In January 1943, a convoy of 5 destroyers and 5 transports successfully reached New Guinea, despite Allied air attacks. Only 2 transports were lost. 4,000 Japanese troops landed successfully. The bombing campaign was failing. Military planners were caught in a dilemma. They couldn't let enemy convoys sail unmolested, but they didn't have weapons that worked. Something radical was needed. Something that would fundamentally change the equation. That something was about to arrive in the form of an unconventional genius who didn't care what the engineering manuals said was impossible. Paul Irvin Gunn was born on October 18, 1899, in Quitman, Arkansas. Wikipedia. By 1942, he was 43 years old in a war dominated by young men, which is precisely how he earned his nickname. The teenage and 20-something air crews he worked with started calling him Pappy, and the name stuck. But age was irrelevant when it came to innovation, and Pappy Gunn had innovation in his blood. Gunn had enlisted in the Navy prior to America's entry into the First World War, eventually serving as an aircraft mechanic whilst learning to fly on his own time. He was stubborn, brilliant with machines, and possessed an almost supernatural ability to see solutions others missed. After 21 years in the Navy, rising to the rank of Chief Petty Officer, he retired in December 1939. But retirement didn't suit Gunn. He moved to the Philippines, working for a wealthy Filipino businessman flying a twin-engine Beechcraft, and helped establish Philippine Airlines. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Gunn was immediately recommissioned, this time into the Army Air Corps with the rank of captain. His family was in Manila when the Japanese invaded, and they were captured. His wife Polly and their 4 children spent the war in internment camps whilst Gunn fought desperately, not just for his country, but knowing his family was in enemy hands. This personal anguish drove him. Every Japanese ship he helped sink, every convoy destroyed, brought the end of the war and his family's liberation one step closer. In 1942, Gunn was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for flying an unarmored airplane into hostile airspace to deliver medical supplies to the besieged troops on Bataan. The mission was suicidal by any rational calculation. Japanese fighters controlled the skies. Anti-aircraft guns ringed the approaches. But Gunn went in anyway, successfully delivering desperately needed medical supplies to dying men. It was the kind of fearless, unorthodox operation that defined his entire war. By the summer of 1942, Gunn found himself in Australia, and that's where the real innovation began. He started looking at the A-20 Havoc light bombers of the 3rd Attack Group. These aircraft were decent enough, capable of carrying bombs, but they weren't particularly effective against the kinds of targets the 5th Air Force was facing. Gunn looked at the Havoc's glass nose, where a bombardier normally sat with a bomb sight, and had a radical thought. What if you replaced the bombardier with machine guns? What if you turned a bomber into a gunship? Gunn began installing several 50-caliber machine guns into the nose of A-20 Havoc light bombers, transforming them for low-level strafing attacks. He was scavenging weapons from wrecked fighters, aircraft that had crashed or been too badly damaged to repair but whose machine guns were still serviceable. With a small team of talented mechanics, Gunn started fabricating mounting brackets, reinforcing airframes, running ammunition feeds. The work was done in the field, far from any factory or engineering department. When Major General George Kenny arrived in Australia to take command of the Allied Air Forces in the Southwest Pacific Theater in the summer of 1942, he found Gunn's modifications already underway. Kenny was exactly the kind of commander who appreciated unorthodox thinking. Impressed by Gunn's innovative abilities, Kenny immediately made him a member of his personal staff, placing the old naval aviator in charge of special projects. The initial tests were promising. A-20s fitted with nose-mounted machine guns could strafe ground targets and shipping with devastating effect. But Kenny and Gunn had bigger ideas. The A-20 was a light bomber with limited range and payload. What if they applied the same concept to the B-25 Mitchell, a much larger medium bomber? The B-25 could carry more guns, more ammunition, more bombs, and had the range to reach targets deep in Japanese-held territory. Gunn stripped the bomber's glass nose and replaced it with solid metal packed with up to 8 forward-firing machine guns. 4 guns were mounted directly in the nose, positioned through the original bomb-aiming panel. This made air sealing easier and kept the modifications relatively simple. But Gunn didn't stop there. He fabricated external gun pods, streamlined packages that could be bolted to each side of the fuselage just below the cockpit. Each pod contained 2 more 50-caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Add those 4 cheek guns to the 4 nose guns, and you had 8 forward-firing weapons, all controlled by the pilot. The engineering challenges were immense. The recoil from 8 M2 Browning machine guns firing simultaneously generated enormous forces. Each gun produced significant vibration and stress on the airframe. The muzzle blast was intense enough to buckle thin aluminium fuselage panels. Gunn's team had to reinforce the entire nose section, strengthen the fuselage skin around the gun pods, and add additional bracing between the fuselage and engine nacelles to prevent the wings from being damaged by recoil forces. Ammunition supply was another problem. 8 guns firing at 600 rounds per minute meant the aircraft could expend nearly 5,000 rounds per minute. The ammunition boxes had to be carefully positioned for weight distribution whilst still allowing reliable feeding to all 8 weapons. The mechanics worked out systems of belts and chutes, testing and retesting until the guns could fire continuously without jamming. But the most significant problem was that the entire concept violated accepted engineering wisdom. The B-25 had been designed as a level bomber, not a low-altitude gunship. Loading it with machine guns and expecting it to survive the stresses of combat whilst flying just above the waves seemed reckless. Engineers at North American Aviation, the company that built the B-25, were skeptical. Some called the modifications dangerous. Others said they were impossible, that the airframe couldn't handle it, that the aircraft would shake itself apart. Pappy Gunn didn't care what the engineers said. He cared about results. And results were about to speak very loudly indeed. The modified B-25s needed more than just guns. They needed a tactic that would allow them to effectively attack ships whilst minimizing their exposure to anti-aircraft fire. Major William Benn developed the skip bombing tactic, which involved flying just above the waves and releasing bombs that ricocheted across the water into enemy hulls. Skip bombing was brilliantly simple in concept but extraordinarily difficult in execution. The B-25 would approach its target at extremely low altitude, sometimes as low as 200 feet above the water. The pilot would line up on the target ship, flying straight and level, closing the distance rapidly. At the critical moment, typically between 200 and 500 yards from the target, the bombardier would release the bombs. But these weren't ordinary bomb releases. The bombs were fitted with 4 to 5 second delayed fuses. When the bombs hit the water, they didn't explode. Instead, like a stone skipping across a pond, they bounced. The angle of approach, the speed of the aircraft, the altitude, all had to be calculated precisely. If done correctly, the bomb would skip once, twice, sometimes 3 times across the surface before slamming into the side of the target ship below the waterline. Only then would the delayed fuse detonate, ripping open the hull from inside or just beneath it. The physics were elegant. A bomb that missed by skipping over the target would explode in the water on the far side, still close enough that the underwater explosion could buckle hull plates and cause catastrophic damage. It was vastly more effective than high-altitude bombing, where near misses were just splashes. Skip bombing turned near misses into kills. But flying that low and straight made the aircraft incredibly vulnerable. Ships' anti-aircraft gunners could track low-flying aircraft easily. Light automatic weapons, 20mm and 40mm guns, were devastatingly effective against aircraft at close range. This is where Gunn's gun modifications became crucial. The 8 forward-firing machine guns could suppress the ship's defensive armament. As the B-25 came in on its attack run, all 8 guns would open fire simultaneously, raking the target ship's deck from bow to stern. The effect was apocalyptic. The battery of 8 guns had a total throw weight of about 215 pounds per second. Picture that for a moment. 215 pounds of high-velocity projectiles every single second, all concentrated on a target area. Gun crews were killed at their stations. Anti-aircraft weapons were destroyed before they could fire. Bridge crews were slaughtered. Deck cargo exploded. In the space of a few seconds, a ship could be transformed from a functioning vessel into a burning wreck. The tactics were refined through practice. By early 1943, squadrons were perfecting the combination of strafing and skip bombing. The results were remarkable. Ships that had previously dodged high-altitude bombs with ease were now being hit repeatedly. But these tactics had never been tested against a major convoy. That test was coming. By February 1943, the Japanese military situation in New Guinea was deteriorating. Allied forces had halted the Japanese advance and were beginning to push back. The garrison at La, a strategically vital port on New Guinea's northern coast, needed reinforcement desperately. If La fell, Japanese positions throughout the region would collapse. On 14 February, aerial photographs showed 79 vessels in Rabaul harbor, including 45 merchant ships and 6 transports, revealing that another convoy was being prepared. Allied intelligence was tracking every move. Radio intercepts, decoded messages, reconnaissance flights, all painted a picture of major Japanese naval movement. The Americans knew something big was coming. On 16 February, naval codebreakers in Melbourne and Washington finished decrypting and translating a coded message revealing the Japanese intention to land convoys at Wewak, Madam, and La. The Allies knew not just that a convoy was coming, but where it was going and approximately when. This was intelligence gold, the kind of advantage that could turn a battle before it even began. The convoy that finally assembled was formidable. 8 transport ships carrying nearly 7,000 troops, plus ammunition, food, medical supplies, everything needed to sustain and reinforce the La garrison. Escorting them were 8 destroyers from 3 different classes, Fubuki, Asashio, and Kajiro types. These were modern, capable warships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and crewed by experienced sailors. The Japanese were not going to let this convoy be picked off easily. The convoy departed Rabaul and began its voyage to La, steaming through the Bismarck Sea. Japanese commanders were confident. They had fighter cover from land-based aircraft. The destroyers provided a steel ring of protection around the transports. Previous convoys had gotten through despite Allied air attacks. There was no reason to think this one would be different. They were catastrophically wrong. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea began on the morning of March 2, 1943, when the Japanese convoy was spotted by Allied reconnaissance aircraft off the north coast of New Britain. Weather had been poor, with low clouds helping conceal the Japanese ships, but now conditions were clearing. General George Kenney, reading the intelligence reports in Douglas MacArthur's office, knew this was the moment they had been preparing for. Over 90 aircraft took off from Port Moresby and other Allied bases. The strike force was diverse: B-17 flying fortresses for medium-altitude bombing, Australian Beaufighters for low-level strafing, and the modified B-25s that Pappy Gunn had created. The plan was to attack in coordinated waves from multiple directions and altitudes, overwhelming the convoy's defenses. By 10 o'clock on the morning of March 3, the battle had begun in earnest. 13 B-17 flying fortresses bombed from medium altitude, with these attacks intended to disperse the convoy by forcing vessels to break station to avoid being hit. The high-altitude bombers scored few direct hits, but they succeeded in breaking up the convoy's tight formation. Ships scattered, trying to evade the falling bombs, and in doing so, they made themselves vulnerable to what came next. 13 Royal Australian Air Force Beaufighters from No. 30 Squadron made a mast-level attack. These twin-engine fighters were heavily armed with 4 20mm cannons in the nose and 6 wing-mounted machine guns. Some Japanese captains thought the Beaufighters were going to make a torpedo attack because they altered course to meet them head-on, to present a smaller profile. It was a fatal mistake. The Beaufighters weren't carrying torpedoes. They were strafing, and by turning toward them, the ships had presented their entire length as a target. The Australian pilots raked the vessels from bow to stern with devastating cannon fire. Then came Pappy Gunn's gunships. 12 specially modified B-25 Mitchells, led by Major Ed Larner, came in at masthead height. The 8-gun noses opened fire, and the effect was beyond anything the Japanese had experienced. According to Garrett Middlebrook, a co-pilot in one of the B-25s, what he saw looked like little sticks flying up off the deck of the ship, twisting crazily in the air and falling into the water, before he realized he was watching hundreds of Japanese soldiers blown off the deck by machine guns. Major Larner's lead bomber struck first, with his 8 guns shredding decks and gun crews before 2 500-pound bombs skipped into the transport Tiyomaru, and in seconds, the ship was torn open and sinking. Lieutenant Ralph Dello followed, his bombs ripping through another transport. Ship after ship was hit. The skip bombing technique worked exactly as designed. Bombs bounced across the water and slammed into hulls. Those that missed exploded close alongside, buckling plates and opening seams. Ships began settling, listing, burning. The Japanese destroyers tried desperately to defend the convoy. Their anti-aircraft guns fired frantically, filling the sky with shells and tracers. Japanese Zero fighters dove through the Allied formations, trying to break up the attacks. But the coordination of the Allied assault was overwhelming. While B-17s attacked from above, drawing fire and attention, the low-level attackers came in from multiple directions. The boat fighters and B-25s were moving so fast, so low, that by the time a gun crew could track one aircraft, it had already passed and another was coming from a different angle. The Japanese convoy had been shattered on March 3rd, but it wasn't destroyed. Several ships were still afloat, though many were damaged and barely moving. Survivors clung to wreckage. The destroyers attempted to pick up men from the water. Japanese commanders hoped that under cover of darkness, the surviving ships could reach Laos or at least get close enough to shore to beach themselves and offload their troops and supplies. The Allies had no intention of letting that happen. On the morning of March 4th, reconnaissance aircraft located the surviving ships. Another massive strike was launched. B-25s returned to finish what they had started. By this time, the pilots and crews had refined their tactics even further based on the previous day's combat experience. They knew where ships were vulnerable, how to coordinate their attacks for maximum effect. Captain Jacques Hennebrey made 15 strafing and bombing passes despite fighter opposition, with his gunner shooting down one of the attacking fighters whilst the rest backed off. Lieutenant Charles Howe attacked 5 ships during his time with the convoy, scoring 2 bomb hits on an already damaged transport. The relentlessness of the attacks was extraordinary. Aircraft would make their bombing runs, then circle back for additional strafing passes. Some pilots attacked the same ship multiple times, ensuring it was completely destroyed. The orders from command were explicit and ruthless: destroy everything. Allow nothing to reach shore. This wasn't just about sinking ships. It was about ensuring that not a single crate of supplies, not a single soldier, reached the Japanese garrison at Laos. The pilots followed these orders with grim determination. After the ships were destroyed, they turned their attention to survivors in the water and debris floating on the surface. It was brutal, but this was total war in the Pacific, where mercy was a luxury neither side could afford. By the time the last Allied aircraft departed the area on March 5th, the destruction was total. All 8 Japanese transports were sunk, along with 4 destroyers. Only a handful of vessels escaped. The Bismarck Sea was littered with burning wreckage, oil slicks, and debris. Of the nearly 7,000 troops who had sailed from Rabaul, fewer than 1,300 made it ashore. At least 3,000 Japanese soldiers died, whilst just 13 Allied airmen were killed in the battle. The strategic impact was immediate and profound. Japan's Imperial General Headquarters decided there would be no more attempts to land troops at Laos. The losses incurred in the Bismarck Sea caused grave concern for the security of Japanese positions throughout the region. From that point forward, Japan would attempt to resupply its new Guinea garrisons only with small barges hugging the coastline, often moving under cover of darkness. Large-scale convoy operations were too dangerous. For the Allies, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated everything Pappy, Gunn, and George Kenney had been working toward. The modified B-25 gunships, combined with skip bombing tactics, had proven devastatingly effective. The engineers who had said the modifications were impossible had been proven spectacularly wrong. The aircraft hadn't shaken apart. The guns had worked flawlessly. The tactics had been brilliant. North American aviation took notice. North American aviation eventually began incorporating variations of Gunn's armament innovations into later models of the B-25. The factory started producing B-25G models with even heavier armament, including a 75mm cannon in the nose. Later versions, the B-25H and B-25J, would carry even more machine guns. Some B-25Js were equipped with 18 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, making them the most heavily armed aircraft in the world at that time. The success at Bismarck Sea was not an isolated incident. It proved a template for future operations. On November 2, 1943, Allied forces launched a massive raid on Rabaul Harbor, one of Japan's most important bases in the Southwest Pacific. While 6 P-38 squadrons flew top cover, Major Ben Fridge with 4 squadrons of B-25s machine-gunned and dropped phosphorus bombs on anti-aircraft positions, whilst Major Hennebrey led his squadrons into Rabaul Harbor through the smoke at masthead height. Of the 38 vessels and 20 merchant ships in the harbor that day, 30 received direct hits in what was described as the toughest, hardest-fought engagement of the war, including 1 heavy cruiser, 1 destroyer tender, 1 submarine tender, 3 destroyers, 2 naval auxiliary craft, 3 minesweepers, 16 merchant vessels, 2 tankers, and a tug. General Kenney reported that in the space of 12 minutes, Allied forces had destroyed or damaged 114,000 tons of Japanese shipping and shot down or destroyed on the ground 85 aircraft. The modified B-25s continued operating throughout the Pacific War. They attacked shipping convoys, raided airfields, destroyed bridges, and provided close air support for ground forces. In the Philippines, Okinawa, and throughout the island-hopping campaign, the gunships proved their worth again and again. What had started as a field modification by a stubborn middle-aged genius had become a standard weapons system that helped win the war. For his innovations and combat service, Gunn was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross with a second award, the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Air Medal, and 9 Purple Hearts. 9 Purple Hearts. That number tells you something about the kind of war Pappy Gunn fought. He wasn't a staff officer safe behind a desk. He flew combat missions, tested his own modifications under fire, and was wounded repeatedly. In late 1944, while stationed in the Philippines, Gunn was wounded in a Japanese bombing attack on Leyte. The injuries were severe enough to remove him from combat operations. But by then, the Philippines had been liberated, which meant Pappy finally got what he had been fighting for since December 1941. His family was freed from internment. After years of separation, after fighting a war whilst knowing his wife and children were in enemy hands, he was reunited with them. One can only imagine that reunion, the relief and joy after so much fear and uncertainty. Gunn retired from the army as a full colonel on June 30, 1948, due to physical disability. He re-established the airline he had started in the Philippines before the war. But Pappy Gunn's story has a tragic ending. On October 11, 1957, whilst flying a charter plane, he was caught in a storm and killed in the ensuing crash. He was just weeks away from his 58th birthday. A man who had survived some of the most dangerous combat missions of World War II, who had flown through storms of anti-aircraft fire, was killed in a civilian aviation accident. The irony is bitter. Gunn is buried at Barranca's National Cemetery at Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, not far from where he had trained as a young naval aviator decades earlier. His grave is visited by aviation enthusiasts and military historians who know the story of what he accomplished. But the truth is, most people have never heard of Pappy Gunn. His name doesn't appear in most general histories of World War II. He never achieved the fame of aces like Bong or Maguire, or bomber commanders like LeMay. Yet his contribution to the war effort was immense. The modifications he pioneered helped turn the tide in the Southwest Pacific. The tactics he helped develop saved countless Allied lives by destroying enemy reinforcements before they could reach the battlefield. And he did all of this not because he was ordered to, but because he saw a problem and refused to accept that it couldn't be solved. He looked at what everyone said was impossible and made it work anyway. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea and the success of the B-25 gunships had implications far beyond the immediate tactical victory. They fundamentally challenged assumptions about naval warfare and the role of air power. For decades, navies had been the dominant force in controlling sea lanes and projecting power. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers ruled the oceans. The idea that land-based bombers could decisively defeat naval forces was controversial. Billy Mitchell had argued for this possibility back in the 1920s, famously sinking captured German warships in demonstration bombing tests. But those were stationary targets, and Mitchell's claims had been met with skepticism from naval advocates. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved Mitchell's theories in actual combat conditions. A convoy of warships, fully manned and defended, supported by fighter aircraft, had been annihilated by land-based bombers. Not damaged. Not forced to retreat. Annihilated. This had profound strategic implications. It meant that any nation with strong land-based air power could contest sea control, even against numerically superior naval forces. It validated the enormous investment America and its allies were making in bomber production. It also terrified Japanese planners, who realized that their entire strategy of holding an island perimeter depended on their ability to reinforce and resupply those islands by sea. If they couldn't move convoys safely, the perimeter would collapse. The Japanese tried various countermeasures. They increased fighter escorts for convoys. They installed more anti-aircraft guns on ships. They attempted to move supplies by submarine and by fast destroyer runs under cover of darkness. None of these measures solved the fundamental problem. Allied air power, equipped with the right weapons and tactics, could find and destroy shipping with devastating efficiency. One of the most remarkable aspects of this story is how quickly innovation happened when necessity demanded it. In early 1942, American bomber crews were struggling to hit ships with any consistency. By March 1943, just over a year later, they had developed and perfected a weapons system and tactical doctrine that could destroy entire convoys. That kind of rapid innovation doesn't happen by accident. It requires several key ingredients. First, you need creative thinkers who aren't bound by conventional wisdom. Pappy Gunn was that kind of thinker. He didn't ask whether modifying bombers was according to regulation. He asked whether it would work. When engineers said it was impossible, he didn't argue. He built it and proved them wrong. Second, you need commanders willing to support unorthodox ideas. George Kenney was that kind of commander. He could have shut down Gunn's modifications, insisted on doing things by the book, waited for official approval from higher headquarters. Instead, he recognized genius when he saw it and gave Gunn the resources and authority to make his ideas reality. Third, you need skilled mechanics and technicians who can turn concepts into functioning hardware under field conditions. Gunn had a team of talented people working with him, men who could fabricate parts from scrap, who understood aircraft systems intimately, who could solve problems creatively. Without them, Gunn's ideas would have remained just ideas. Fourth, you need pilots willing to risk their lives testing new tactics in combat. The crews who flew those first modified B-25s into battle didn't know for certain that the aircraft would hold together under the stress. They were testing revolutionary tactics against an enemy that was shooting back. That required courage of a very high order. And finally, you need the pressure of necessity. When the alternative is defeat, when men are dying because existing methods don't work, innovation becomes not just desirable but essential. The desperate circumstances of 1942 created an environment where unconventional solutions could flourish. We should take a moment to appreciate the weapon at the heart of this story, the Browning M250 caliber machine gun. Designed by John Browning in the aftermath of World War I, the M2 is one of the most successful weapons ever created. It's still in service today, over a century after its basic design was established. That longevity speaks to the genius of its engineering. The M2 fires a half-inch diameter projectile at approximately 3,000 feet per second. The cartridge, the 50 BMG, was designed to penetrate light armor and destroy equipment at ranges beyond what smaller machine guns could achieve. In aircraft installations, the M2 had a rate of fire around 800 rounds per minute for the M2 variant used in aircraft. With 8 guns firing simultaneously, a B-25 gunship could put out over 6,000 rounds per minute. The kinetic energy delivered on target was staggering. The ammunition types were crucial to effectiveness. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate ship hulls and ignite fuel and ammunition. Tracer rounds allowed pilots to see where their fire was going and adjust aim in real time. The combination meant that every burst from a B-25's nose was a mixture of penetration, incendiary effect, and visible trajectory. Ships hit by this kind of firepower didn't just take damage. They were systematically destroyed, with fires starting, ammunition cooking off, structural members cut apart. The reliability of the M2 was equally important. Combat aircraft operate in harsh environments with vibration, temperature extremes, and high G-forces. The guns had to function flawlessly under these conditions, and they did. Pilots reported that jams were rare, and when they did occur, they could often be cleared quickly. This reliability meant that when a B-25 made its attack run, its guns would fire, which sounds obvious but was actually a significant engineering achievement. We must be clear-eyed about what this kind of warfare entailed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was extraordinarily one-sided in terms of casualties. Thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors died. The accounts from survivors described nightmarish scenes, ships breaking apart, men trapped below decks as vessels capsized, oil-covered survivors machine-gunned in the water. It was brutal. Modern sensibilities might recoil from some of the tactics employed, particularly the strafing of survivors. But we must understand the context. This was total war against an enemy that had attacked Pearl Harbor without warning, that had committed atrocities throughout Asia, that showed no mercy to prisoners or civilians. The Pacific War was fought with a savagery that reflected the hatred both sides felt. Neither the Japanese nor the Allies gave quarter. Surrender was rare on both sides. Every Japanese soldier who reached Laos would have fought Allied troops, would have killed Allied soldiers. Preventing those reinforcements from arriving saved Allied lives. That was the grim arithmetic of the Pacific War. The Allied aircrews faced their own dangers. Flying at masthead height against ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns required extraordinary courage. Aircraft were hit, damaged, sometimes shot down. Crews were killed or captured. Those who survived often flew mission after mission, accumulating stress and trauma that would last a lifetime. Many of these men were barely out of their teens, yet they flew combat missions that would have terrified experienced veterans. The mechanics who maintained the aircraft worked endless hours under difficult conditions, often at primitive forward bases with inadequate tools and supplies. They kept the modified B-25s flying through ingenuity and sheer determination. Without their work, the pilots would have been grounded. War requires sacrifice, and World War II required it on a scale almost unimaginable today. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a decisive victory, but victories in war always come at a cost, paid in lives and suffering. What can we learn from this story that applies beyond the specific context of World War II? Several lessons emerge that remain relevant. First, innovation often comes from unexpected places. Pappy Gunn wasn't an engineer at a defense contractor or a scientist at a research laboratory. He was a middle-aged aviator with hands-on experience and a willingness to experiment. Organizations, whether military or civilian, need to be open to ideas from all levels, not just from designated experts. Second, rigid adherence to doctrine can be fatal. If the 5th Air Force had insisted on following pre-war bomber doctrine, continuing to attack ships from high altitude despite clear evidence it wasn't working, the Japanese would have successfully reinforced their garrisons throughout 1943. Willingness to question assumptions and try new approaches is essential. Third, the perfect is the enemy of the good. Gunn's modifications weren't perfect. They were field improvisations, rough around the edges. But they worked well enough to matter, and that's what counted. Waiting for an ideal solution can mean missing the opportunity to implement a good solution. Fourth, integration of systems matters more than any single component. The B-25 gunships were effective because they combined heavy forward armament with skip bombing tactics, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, and proper intelligence about enemy movements. No single element was sufficient. Success required all elements working together. Fifth, leadership support for innovation is critical. Kenny's willingness to back Gunn's unconventional ideas made the difference between those ideas being tested in combat and being buried in bureaucracy. Leaders need the courage to support promising innovations even when they seem risky or unorthodox. Finally, necessity really is the mother of invention. When the need is desperate enough, people find ways to solve problems that seemed insoluble. The pressure of war accelerated innovation dramatically. This doesn't mean we should celebrate war, but we should recognize that challenges can drive human ingenuity to remarkable heights. We should spend a moment appreciating the platform that made all this possible, the North American B-25 Mitchell itself. Named after aviation pioneer Billy Mitchell, the B-25 was one of the most versatile aircraft of World War II. It served in every theater of the war, performing roles from level bombing to ground attack, from anti-submarine patrol to photographic reconnaissance. The B-25 was powered by two Wright R-2600 radial engines, each producing over 1,700 horsepower. This gave it a top speed around 300 miles per hour and a range of over 1,300 miles with a standard load. It could carry 3,000 pounds of bombs internally, more on external racks. The crew typically consisted of 5 to 6 men: pilot, co-pilot, bombardier/nose gunner, radio operator/waist gunner, turret gunner, and tail gunner. What made the B-25 particularly suitable for Gunn's modifications was its robust construction. The fuselage was strong enough to handle additional weight and stress. The engines provided enough power to maintain performance even with extra armament installed. The aircraft was forgiving to fly, which meant pilots could handle it effectively at low altitude where margins for error were minimal. Over 10,000 B-25s were built during the war. They served with the U.S. Army Air Forces, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps, and Allied air forces including Britain, Australia, China, and the Soviet Union. The aircraft flew more than 200,000 missions, delivering over 100,000 tons of bombs to enemy targets. It was one of the workhorses of the Allied bombing campaign. The B-25 is perhaps most famous for the Doolittle raid in April 1942, when 16 B-25s launched from an aircraft carrier bombed Tokyo in a spectacular morale-boosting mission. But the aircraft's contribution to winning the war was far more substantial in unglamorous roles like the anti-shipping campaign in the Southwest Pacific. This is where the Mitchell truly proved its worth, day after day, mission after mission, destroying the enemy's ability to wage war. On a fundamental level, this story is about the triumph of practical innovation over theoretical limitations. Engineers said Pappy Gunn's modifications were impossible. They weren't. Doctrine said medium bombers couldn't effectively attack ships. They could. Conventional wisdom said field modifications couldn't match factory production. They did, and eventually, the factory adopted the field modifications. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the most decisive air-sea battles in history. In 3 days, Allied air forces destroyed an entire Japanese convoy, fundamentally altering the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific. Japan never again attempted to run major convoys to New Guinea. The garrison at La fell 5 months later, and the Japanese defensive perimeter began its slow collapse. The road to Tokyo had been opened, paved in part by the wreckage of ships at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea. Pappy, Gunn didn't live to see his story told widely. He died in that plane crash in 1957, relatively unknown outside aviation circles. But his legacy lives on. The tactics and modifications he pioneered influenced aircraft design and air combat doctrine for decades. The principle that land-based air power could dominate naval forces shaped Cold War military planning. The idea that field innovation could outpace established engineering informed how military forces approached rapid adaptation. Most importantly, Gunn's story reminds us that individual initiative matters. One person, with the right combination of skill, creativity, and determination, can change the course of history. He wasn't a general or an admiral. He didn't command thousands of troops. He was a mechanic and pilot who saw a problem, devised a solution, and made it work despite everyone telling him it was impossible. The next time someone tells you something can't be done, remember Pappy Gunn and his B-25 gunships. Remember that impossible is often just a failure of imagination. Remember that 12 Japanese ships lie at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea because one stubborn genius refused to accept limitations.